Welcome to part 2 of the Recovering from Trauma series. In this module, Patria King and Georgie Somerset discuss adults and trauma. They explore the physical and emotional impact of trauma and share with you practical tools and strategies for recovery and building that necessary emotional resilience.
Patria, we're going to talk now about how trauma impacts on adults and each of us, and how we might deal with that, some strategies and things. But first of all, what is the impact of trauma on ourselves, our bodies, not just our minds?
Well, it can vary, of course, enormously from person to person, and some people are very resilient and have had a lot of trauma in their life, and they'll deal with trauma quite differently from someone for whom it's brand new. But for most people, the first 6 to 8 weeks, we're in a bit of shock, a bit numb. It's almost like it's happened to somebody else, or we think we're going to wake up out of this nightmare sometime soon. We tend also to go into doing rather than being, so we tend to fill up our time with a lot of busyness of what might need to happen practically. Maybe there's housing, or there's jobs, or there's things that need to be done to meet whatever the situation is, if it's a diagnosis or if it's a disaster or whatever the trauma might be. So it's sometimes easier to feel like I'm doing something rather than checking in with how do I feel I'm being in this situation. And these are healthy ways of getting through an experience. We kind of galvanise ourselves just to physically cope, and we park the emotional aspects of the trauma until a later time. But for some people that can become a bit of a habit then, and they fill up their life with so much busyness that they never revisit the feelings around the trauma. And some people will numb themselves or just go into feeling complete overwhelm. Some people will certainly go into the fight or flight mechanism. And of course this was a setup in our bodies to help us to cope with great stress, so that we produce a lot of cortisol and adrenaline in the system so that we can run like mad, or we can fight whatever the trauma is. Or there's a third F though that a lot of people also have, and that's they just go into freeze. And a lot of people don't understand this one, but if you had a lot of trauma when you were a child, for instance, a child doesn't know how to get themselves away from trauma, and they don't know how to resolve trauma, and so they tend to just go into freeze. So the freezers tend to be people who may also have had quite a lot of trauma in their early life. And for most adults, we know that there are things to either we need to get ourselves away from the situation that we're in, or we need to galvanise ourselves to deal with the situation. But we tend to park all of our feelings because they're not really helpful in that time of having to address the trauma.
And what's happening in the body at that time when we have that adrenaline, that cortisol, and there's a certain amount of doing, and certainly we see great evidence of that. We see people taking action and responding, and the compassion and care that often comes, and the physical doing.
Yes.
But and that happens, I think, across the world. But what happens in the body if you, once that sort of doing stops, and yet the cortisol and the adrenaline is still in there? Well,
of course, cortisol and adrenaline increase our heart rate, they change our breathing, it has effects on our skin so that we perspire more easily, so that we can cool the body down. The blood goes out to our muscles so that we can run or fight, rather than to our essential organs. It goes to the brain so that we can read our immediate environment really. So we could, once we've gone through the process of dealing with whatever the physical trauma is, we could remain in that heightened state where we're hyper-vigilant around everything and don't know how to switch off our mind at 3 a.m. and things are still churning through. So whilst these are appropriate responses to an initial trauma, they're really not helpful long term. But sometimes it feels more powerful to be doing than to have the feelings that we might be having. And so sometimes for men in particular, you know, they just want to get out there and do something, even though what they're doing might get destroyed again in 5 minutes or next week. But they feel more in control if they're doing something rather than just feeling. the enormity of what's happened to them. And it's often not until weeks and sometimes months and sometimes years later that we are able to revisit the emotional trauma of what's happened. And you see, words like convalescence have completely gone out of our vocabulary. We used to indeed have little convalescent homes, little homes for the bewildered, you know, usually set upon a hilltop somewhere, and after a trauma or an illness, they popped you into a home for the bewildered and they put a little blankie on your knee and you sat and you stared into the distance. And that's where you physically recovered. It's where you emotionally, psychologically took on board the enormous change that you'd been through, where you integrated that and emerged with hopefully some greater wisdom and greater compassion for yourself and others.
And understanding of what's happened
Yes.
and acknowledging.
Yes, so that it becomes part of your history rather than something that continues to gnaw away at you in the present.
And which allows you to be a being, not a doing.
Exactly.
You know, we are human
We
beings.
are human beings, exactly, rather than human
actually-
doings.
And being in that moment. So allowing in particular, I guess, after the immediate period, but allowing yourself just to be
Yes.
and to move through those emotions.
Because if we don't, you know, we may end up with disrupted sleep patterns. We may find difficulty in switching off our mind in the middle of the night. We may find that we're comforting ourselves with food, or that exercise goes out the window, and that we might find ourselves drowning our sorrows or numbing ourselves with drugs or some activity that helps to comfort us but doesn't really help to resolve the situation.
And that emotional shutdown can then impact on so many of the other relationships and the people around you who are also trying to recover and who you have the contact with, and
Exactly.
you might look the same but
Yes.
appear different.
Yes, which is why it's always important to inquire, do you feel as good as you look? Rather than just say, oh, you look fabulous, which often means, please don't tell me how you feel, because I'm not going to know what to say, I'm not going to know what to do if you're not coping, because I'm only just coping myself. So it could be that I can't take on anybody else's story because I feel like I'm just on the edge of falling over the abyss myself. And sometimes too, you know, we think, we assume that person is okay because they look okay. And you know, depending on our time, depending on our resilience at that time, we may or may not want to know what's going on for another person.
And the feelings can come and go quite markedly, I think too. That's the trauma can sort of come in waves as to how you respond to it.
Exactly. And you know, sometimes too you can visit very strong emotions at the opposite end of the scale within 5 minutes. And that can be very confusing when you think, oh, you know, how come I'm laughing when this terrible trauma has happened? And it's not okay for me to laugh, to find ever joy in my life ever again, given the enormity of this loss or this trauma or this tragedy. How can I possibly be happy? And so we need to develop some compassion for ourselves and to recognise that we can honour what's happened to us, we can honour our losses, we can honour our grief, we can honour the importance of this person in our life by how we choose to live in the present, rather than deciding that our future has to be dedicated to this trauma and that we can never be happy again. Of course, we can move through the emotions so that we find a way of integrating that into our body, into our life, into our, hopefully our wisdom and our ability to have compassion in the future.
So Petrea, looking at how this impacts on our bodies and what happens, for some people this might be the first time they've experienced a trauma, and what are some of the practical ways that they can actually deal with what's going on? We've talked about that physical reaction. What can they actually do about that? What are some of the things that they can do every day?
You know, it's often not until we get to that place in life where we say, that's it, something has to change, and it's me. I can't change what's happened out there. I can't change the drama, the disappointment, the disaster, the diagnosis, the death. I can't change whatever the outer thing is. What I can change is who I'm going to be in relationship to that. So some people do get stuck in blame and resentment, and this isn't fair and it shouldn't have happened and I don't deserve this. Why didn't it happen to someone else? But if we want to find peace of mind and healing through this experience, we do need to get to that place where this did happen and it happened to me. And given that I'm a woman, a man in this circumstance, what's an appropriate response rather than just a reaction?
Yes.
So a reaction may be anything from drowning our sorrows, comforting ourselves, doing all manner of things. A response could be quite different. And a response might be just creating some quiet time for yourself every day. It might be saying, okay, every morning I'm going to go for a walk. I might be getting plenty of exercise cleaning up the mess, but that's not the kind of exercise I'm talking about. I'm talking about going for a walk where you just go for a walk and you don't go for a walk and think at the same time. It might be, that quiet time of the day, just as we do for children often, lighting a candle, arranging some flowers, doing something that's a settling, quietening activity for you can be very healing and nurturing. So having some of those routines in your life that bring you back to the present moment.
And looking after yourself, I'm hearing you sort of
Yes.
focusing on looking after yourself so that you're able to look after others who are dealing with this.
It's so easy to get caught up in the drama of it all and put aside my needs because this big disaster's happening and I'm going to have to look after everybody else at the expense of my own needs. But really the greatest gift you can give into chaos or into confusion or into fear or anguish or disruption is really the gift of your own peace. It's when the mind is quiet, when the body is cared for, when all of those things are done, that's when you find your intuition works. That's where you find your creativity works. And that's when you know that, where you can hear that still small voice that knows what to do, doesn't have to think what to do. And so it's really important that we replenish ourselves before the kids, before the family, before any of the details of our life. First know yourself and fluff yourself up, and then you're going to bring your well fluffed up self to the chaos, to the challenge, to the crisis, and you're going to function far better in that situation than bringing your irritable, exhausted, depressed, overwhelmed self to that situation.
That no one really wants to deal with.
No one, yes, exactly.
It just exacerbates the problem that's on around you. So tell us more about the being able to fluff yourself up.
Well, the first step is really to recognise, how do you know when you're at the end of your tether? And we suggest people actually write these things down, their own particular ways, because it'll be really different for everybody. Some people will isolate. They'll withdraw and disappear into their shell, particularly if they're a more private person or someone who's not necessarily easy with their feelings and knows how to talk about what they're feeling. Some people will be out there talking to everyone that will listen and will be running around full of activity. Some people will overwhelm themselves with busyness and conversations and never find any stillness in the midst of that. Some people will bite their nails or drink too much or take drugs or get irritable and snappy and clumsy and forgetful. And there are four major things that we sacrifice when we're at the end of our tether, and those are our sense of humour goes, because we're not here to see what's so funny. Our spontaneity goes for the same reason. Our creativity dries up and we lose confidence in ourselves. Those are the four major ones, but everyone has their idiosyncratic particular ones.
And it's important for us to understand what they are.
Absolutely.
So that we know when that's starting to happen, because I think anybody who's been a parent will recognise the loss of sense of humour when you're sort of at the end of your tether. And that's just exacerbated, isn't it, in a bigger proportion when it's a traumatic event.
So we suggest that people actually write down their half dozen favourite ways of manifesting stress and put those up on your bathroom mirror. And every day when you're brushing your teeth or gazing lovingly at yourself in the mirror, just cruise down that list and make sure none of those behaviours are happening. They need to be our alarm bells, not our normal way of living. And you'll find in the workbook that goes with this series a whole list of the likely things that people are going to be experiencing, or certainly we go into all of this much more deeply in Your Life Matters, which is a book that I wrote that should be available in any library. So then once we understand what are the ways that we manifest stress, we can also focus on, well, what are the things that fluff me up? What are the things that replenish me, that put me back together again? Is it my early morning walk with the dog in the dew? Is it my painting? Is it craft? Is it meditation? Is it yoga? Is it having that solitude every day? Is it the rituals in my life, prayer, my spiritual or religious beliefs or practices? So is it soaking in a warm bath? Is it
perhaps getting together with some other people as well?
Talking to other people who've likewise suffered, who understand your suffering. So, that we're not so isolated in our experience. So we need to understand what are the things that put us back together again. And so that we fill up our own inner bucket, so that we're only ever giving from the overflow. If we're always running around giving out to everyone else from a half-empty bucket, we begin to resent what we're giving to everybody else that we haven't even given to ourselves. And of course, the only place you see this promoted is on aeroplanes, where they say when the mask comes down, first put the mask on you, and when you're breathing normally, put it on the children, put it on the other passengers. They never say we want you to run around the plane and put as many masks on as many people as possible before you collapse. And yet a lot of people are living their life like that, particularly when there's a trauma going on, where they feel a bit at the end of their tether and they go into the great busyness of looking after everybody else and they haven't really attended to themselves.
And certainly for a lot of the people in rural areas, they often feel as though it falls to them and falls to a few people to do that running around. So taking that time to have things that they can implement every day that don't cost anything. It's simply what makes the heart sing.
Exactly.
Sound as though they're really important points to have in place.
And nature, of course, is a wonderful way of reconnecting with, the phase of the moon, the starry sky, the sunset, the sunrise. These moments of the day where there can be just a little bit of quietness, a little bit of wonder, and a little bit of connection to that which is beyond change. These things are happening routinely, habitually. And remember too that we always bring the patterns that we bring out of our childhood, out of our earlier life, we bring those patterns to whatever the present trauma might be. So if our pattern is to go into I do it myself, that was a big one for me, still is a bit of a big one for me. I do it myself, which means I'm not going to ask anyone for help. Everybody else is busy with their trauma. I have to do this myself, and we kind of galvanise ourselves to get through it. So these can also be wonderful opportunities to begin letting go some of the patterns that we might have adopted from the past that no longer serve us in the present.
Maybe paint some new patterns in our lives.
Exactly. And then we can grow through these experiences rather than be damaged by them. Then, these are the experiences that break us open and break our hearts open to greater compassion, to greater wisdom. And it's not about having all the answers, but, love turns up. Love turns up when it doesn't know what to say and it doesn't know what to do. Love turns up, preferably with a casserole in hand, but love turns up. And so it's not about having the answers, having a surefire way to get through this, but it's a willingness to turn up and a willingness to nurture ourselves physically, mentally, emotionally and spiritually, so that when the unexpected, the unthinkable, the unimaginable happens, we've got some inner resources to bring to that circumstance rather than feel completely overwhelmed by it or consumed by it or destroyed by it.
So Petrea, when I was younger and things got a bit difficult, my mother would say, go for a walk and clear your head. And I find myself saying the same thing to my children. Go outside, clear your head. What are some practical things that are solutions, that we can actually do, like the walking? I mean, for me, that's a great one. It doesn't work for everyone, but it really does clear my head.
Exercise is tremendously helpful for people. And so if you can find exercise that works for you. It's funny that we often sacrifice the early morning walk with the dog in the dew the moment we're under stress. And yet had we kept that in as a non-negotiable, that's just something that has to happen, we would have dealt with the stress far more effectively. And so we often tend to throw out the very things that are the most useful things to help us through a difficult patch. So it may be creating some quiet time for yourself. It might be sitting down and reading a book, you know, something that you just find absorbing. It might be some activity that really engages and absorbs you, some craft or painting, or, as one woman said, I lose myself in my painting. And that means that I've lost my story for the time being, and it's just me and the paint. So think about what are those activities, just coming back to the senses of your body as often as you can. So, you know, we might do a practice, you don't have to look weird doing this, you can do it with your eyes open, eyes closed, but just to become aware of your posture, the weight of your body sitting in the seat, the pressure of the chair supporting your body, the floor beneath your feet, the touch and texture of your clothing against the skin, all of the sounds within and outside of the space that you're in. And let your listening run right out until you hear the clouds passing by. And you see, if you then just become aware of your breath as it flows in and out of the body, the rising and falling of your abdomen, the mind immediately comes to rest when we do a practice like that. It's simply to come to our senses, which is what we say to people when they're having a panic attack. Come to your senses, because your body's always here now. And the more we practice that, the more the mind quietens down and we have access to our intuition, which is really the greatest ally that we can have in life. And we can begin to take that mindfulness then into all of our activities. If you've got your hands in the sink and you're washing up, just be with the warmth of the water on your hands, the touch, the texture, all of the sounds around you, so that you bring the mind constantly back to the present moment, rather than its tendency, which is to jump into fretting, fearing, worrying, concern about the future.
And things that may never even happen.
Exactly. Or we go into resenting, blaming, shaming, rewriting history, things in the past. And if we do these practices that bring us to our senses, then the mind quietens down. And then we have access to our intuition and our creativity. So think about, you know, whether it's the lighting of candles or the arranging of fresh flowers, or sometimes just having a chair in a corner of a room, and that's your sacred space. That when you go sit there, it's your time, it's your space, and that you don't have to let anybody else's concerns come into that space. And then even when you're in the midst of busyness, you've only got to think about that chair. Maybe you keep a beautiful shawl on it, or a cushion or something that just kind of brings you back, or create a sacred space in your home where just the memory of that place immediately settles you down again.
And you can feel that physical impact in your body, can't you? It's like
Exactly.
thinking about the beautiful waterfall or the
Yes.
special place on the mountain that you've been to, and
Exactly.
take yourself back there.
Exactly.
And just as the mind can create all these worrying pictures, it can also bring up some beautiful pictures.
And then we become the masters of what's going on internally, because the mind makes a wonderful servant and an appalling master. You know, if you let your mind run the show, you're going to have a very hard time. And which is why these techniques that bring us back to the present moment are so important, because then we don't react to anything. We have the ability moment by moment to make an appropriate response. Because we do say, don't take reactability for your life, take responsibility for your life, your ability to respond to the life that you're having, with all of its dramas, all of its challenges, all of its unexpected, unthinkable things that will happen. And then we become masters of being able to dance with life rather than say it shouldn't be happening, it wasn't meant to happen like this, and going into the stress of that.
And when you're responding, is it also about acknowledging and understanding the feelings that you might be overwhelmed or overjoyed by, that the range of feelings you might incur in a day, and how you deal with those and the response to those?
Well, oftentimes with these disasters, we're confronted by feelings we've never had before, or a depth that we've never experienced before. And so we need to be gentle with ourselves and compassionate with ourselves, and to not expect ourselves to always be performing at the highest level. And indeed to recognise that the people that we share our life with, and I know this is a really hard one to take on for some people, but everybody, ourselves included, everybody on the planet is doing the best they know how, given who they are, what's happened to them, and what they've made of it. And us wanting people to be any different from who they are means that we're going to suffer. You know, when we ask people around the country, how many of you have had success in changing someone else? No one ever puts up their hand. The only person we can change is ourselves. And so we need to have compassion when people are acting out or not coping, and that's coming out in really unskillful ways or in really wounding ways or hurtful ways. One of the principles of attitudinal healing is I can always perceive anger in myself or in others as a call for help rather than as an attack.
And we can choose how we respond to that.
Exactly.
And that responsibility.
Exactly.
We choose the response each time.
And we're not responsible for other people's actions and reactions. We are responsible for our own actions. And so we can be more compassionate with ourselves, and those times when we slip, as one of our facilitators, Bernadette, says, "Oh, how human of me." And that's a really useful one to remember. Oh, how human of me, rather than, oh, I did it again, you know, and we start heaping judgment and criticism on ourselves again. How human of me.
Because we're often our worst critics, and at times like this when we're placed under stress, we will criticise ourselves, what we haven't done, instead of just acknowledging that this is a stage we're at, a feeling we've got today, but we won't be here forever. And
we talked about cultivating gratitude in our children, and that's a really useful thing for us to do as well, is just every day, even though everything in our outer environment might not look the same, might not be the same, infrastructure could be destroyed, routines could be destroyed, all sorts of things destroyed. But if we can learn to focus on something for which to be grateful, the fact that we have got shelter, even though it might not be the shelter that we want, that we have got food, that we have got friends, that we have got this breath. You know, sometimes just coming back to the breath. When I was sick many years ago, my life was reduced down to, there's an inward breath, there's an outward breath. And practicing, because I couldn't get out of the chair, but I could practice just breathing and take joy and gratitude in the fact that right now I can just breathe. And we can either focus on all of the things that we've lost, or we can focus just what we have in this moment for which to be grateful.
So Petrea, looking at some of the really specific tools we can use for building resilience, what else is there that people can actually do?
One of the things that I think a lot of people find really difficult is to say no, especially when everyone around you is hurting in a disaster. We tend to just say yes to everything and feel that we have to be everything to everyone. So, you know, learning how to say no is really difficult for some people because they're so used to saying, yes, I'll be there, yes, I'll do that. So you might need to practice in the bathroom mirror for a while first, you know. Look, thank you so much for asking me. I'd love to say yes, but I have to say no. And then you practice on the pot plant, and then you practice on the dog, and you gradually work yourself up to a person. But recognising what are your priorities right now, and it can be useful even to write those down, and then learning to say no to those other things. Or thank you so much for asking me, but I'm fully committed at present. Or thank you so much for asking me, I'll need to check my diary and get back to you.
And give yourself some space.
So just give yourself a little bit of space to think, is this really a priority for me right now, given the circumstance I'm in, so that you don't always squander all of the energy that you have on meeting somebody else's needs. And I mean, that's a little bit the same with sleep, you know, that we need to find really good ways of getting ourselves to sleep. And that's making that decision. I'm not going to think things through at 3 a.m. Make a deep commitment to yourself. I won't think things through at 3 a.m. I'd much rather get up, have a cup of tea, go for a walk around the house or whatever, but I'm not going to think things through. in the middle of the night, because we never come up with good solutions unless they're insights that suddenly pop into our mind. But chewing things over in the middle of the night is not helpful. And sometimes even the preparation for sleep becomes very important, that you sleep in natural fibres and maybe sleep with the window open. It might be that all of your outer routine has been disrupted, but I do have this mattress, this bed in this place, and I'm now going to put aside my worries for the day, stick them in a bag on the floor, find some ritual that you can put those things aside so that you can just focus on, again, coming back to maybe doing a physical relaxation, so that you talk your way through your body and make sure you switch off all parts of your body. It can be useful not to exercise in the evening, because that kind of gets you going. To have plenty of water, but maybe up until 6 o'clock and not too much in the evening time. It's better to eat at least an hour and a half before you go to sleep, so that your body's digested the food rather than you go to sleep with a full tummy. And maybe just spend a few moments before you go to sleep reflecting on some of the things that you can be grateful for that happened in that day. And that might be a gesture of kindness. It might be that the electricity came back on, or some of the services are coming back into your area, or that you do have some things to be grateful for. Just being alive is enough sometimes to be grateful for. Although I know too that sometimes there are some things worse than death, and that can be surviving everyone that you love who's died. So there are some very great challenges to our peace in any situation where there are really severe disasters. And it's hard to find a little piece of gratitude for being alive when you've lost so much. But we need to focus on these things of how things are improving, and not maybe getting back to normal even, but the fact that we're all still here, that we can be kind to one another, that we can look out for each other.
And what I'm hearing you talk about is setting in place positive patterns that you can draw upon as you go forward, so that perhaps even before something happens in your life, if people are watching this and they haven't had a major trauma, that making sure that some of these things become ritual in your life, so that when these things do occur, you have some patterns to fall back on, and some patterns of thankfulness and gratitude, and finding that small still place that is yours, that isn't about the physical surrounds, but is simply about your body and being in the moment.
Yes. And you know, for a lot of people, they don't know how resilient they are until it's sorely tested. And so if you can learn from other people's experience, do so. Put some of these things into practice long before any disaster comes into your life. And then you'll find that your inner stability, your inner equilibrium won't be near as buffeted if you've put these sorts of practices into your life before the disasters happen. And then you find you're more able to just respond moment by moment, regardless of how chaotic, how whatever the crisis might be, that we can bring that quiet stillness within ourselves to the disaster, to the trauma, to the crisis, rather than bringing our frazzled, irritable, overwhelmed, depressed self to that.
I think what you've covered is how it physically impacts on our body, and how we can control that response to what's happening physically and to those around us. Are there any final things you'd like to say or share that you really feel people need to be aware of when they're in the recovery mode?
I think it's helpful to recognise that, you know, we're more than our bodies. We have a body. We're more than our minds. We have a mind. We're more than our feelings. We have feelings. And to really find peace in the midst of trauma is to anchor our sense of self in that which is beyond change. Because our bodies will change, our minds change, our feelings change. But our essential nature, our consciousness, our awareness, that can be eternally present and eternally in that stillness. And the more we can align ourselves with that, the more we can manage whatever the changes might be that are happening outside of ourselves most skillfully.
So Petrea, thanks for helping us look at how we can look after ourselves and our response to traumas. We're going to look next at communities and how they respond, and how we can help each other within a community to rebuild and have a strong and positive future.
Fabulous. Thank you, Georgie. Thank you.